He was a man forged in silence and sorrow, a lonely rancher who bought a broken, beaten girl named Ilara, not for servitude, but for salvation. Then he realized she was the only one who could mend the shattered pieces of his own desolate world. The wind, a mournful coyote in the eaves of Dust Devil Creek's ramshackle auction house, carried the stench of desperation and cheap whiskey. Inside, under the flickering lamplight that cast grotesque, dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls, Ilara stood upon a makeshift block, a creature of bruised twilight and trembling bones. Her dress, once perhaps a pale calico, was now a tapestry of grime and tears, clinging to a frame so thin it seemed a harsh breath could snap her. Jedediah Sykes, a man whose soul was as sour as the dregs in his perpetually stained tankard, poked her ribs with the butt of his whip, his voice a gravelly sneer that cut through the murmurs of the assembled crowd. "See here, folks. She ain't much to look at now, this one, but she's got a strong back when she ain't malingering with her sicknesses. Too sick to work, she claims. A few more lessons from old Jedediah and she'll learn what work is." A raw, red welt bloomed afresh on her cheekbone, a cruel flower against the pallor of her skin. She didn't cry out, the capacity for such release had been beaten from her long ago, replaced by a hollow-eyed endurance that chilled the few decent souls in the room and thrilled the cruel ones. Her breath hitched, a tiny, ragged sound, almost lost in the jeers and the stamping of muddy boots. The men, a collection of hard-bitten prospectors, drifters, and small-time ranchers, eyed her with varying degrees of callous assessment, some with open lust, others with cold calculation. She was a commodity, a thing to be used up and discarded. The air was thick with their judgments, their whispered assumptions of her worthlessness, her supposed inherent defect that made her sickly and therefore deserving of her fate. The town of Dust Devil Creek itself was a testament to survival at its most brutal, a place where kindness was a foreign currency and mercy a forgotten word. Ilara, branded by her frailty, her quiet suffering, was its most visible scapegoat, a repository for its collective harshness. Every cough, every stumble was twisted into evidence of her defiance, her unwillingness to labor until she dropped for men like Jedediah, who had bought her indenture from some desperate soul further east. He claimed she owed him, that her every breath was a debt to be repaid in toil and pain. The auctioneer, a greasy man with shifty eyes, began his patter, extolling her supposed virtues while Jedediah punctuated his words with jabs and shoves, each one a fresh wave of humiliation washing over the girl who seemed to shrink smaller with every passing second, her gaze fixed on a crack in the dusty floorboards as if it were the only anchor in a sea of torment. The weight of every gaze was a physical blow, every lewd comment a fresh stripe on her soul. This was her existence, a public spectacle of misery, a life measured in the dwindling strength of her own frail body and the rising tide of her owner's brutality. She was a ghost in her own life, a whisper of a girl on the precipice of vanishing entirely into the abyss of frontier cruelty, her only crime the vulnerability that men like Jedediah preyed upon with such savage delight. The dust motes danced in the lamplight, indifferent witnesses to her agony, each one a tiny spark in the vast darkness of her despair. Silas Blackwood stood in the shadows at the back, a silhouette of solitude against the grimy wall, his face half hidden by the brim of his worn hat. He was a man acquainted with ghosts, both the spectral kind that whispered on the prairie winds around his isolated ranch, and the more tangible ones that resided in the hollows of his own memory. A war-born limp was his constant companion, a dull ache that mirrored the deeper throb in his chest where loss had carved its permanent home. He hadn't come for this. He'd come for salt and flour, the mundane necessities that tethered him to the world of men, a world he mostly preferred to keep at a distance. But the raw, agonizing spectacle of Ilara's degradation snared him, a hook in his gut. He watched Jedediah, a man whose cruelty was as predictable as the sunrise, and felt a familiar disgust curdle within him. He saw the girl, not as that sickly burden or stubborn mule Jedediah proclaimed her to be, but as something akin to a trapped sparrow, its wing broken, its song silenced. Her quiet endurance, the way she absorbed the blows without a sound, wasn't weakness, it was a terrible, fragile strength he recognized. It was the strength of the irrevocably wounded. For a long moment, Silas wrestled with himself. Intervention meant trouble, meant drawing the venom of men like Sykes, meant shattering the carefully constructed quiet of his existence. His life on Broken Arrow Ranch was hard, solitary, but it was his. Yet, The image of his younger sister, lost to fever and a hard winter years ago, flickered in his mind's eye, her face superimposed over Ilara's. He saw the tremor in Ilara's hands, the way her eyes, when they briefly lifted, held a universe of unspoken pain. The auctioneer's voice grated, "Who'll start the bidding for this piece of work?" A ripple of ugly laughter. Jedediah leered, yanking Ilara forward. Silas straightened, his decision made, a cold resolve settling in his gut. He moved, his limp barely perceptible, yet each step was heavy with intent. The crowd parted slightly as he approached, a murmur rippling through them. Silas Blackwood was not a man to be trifled with, his silence held more weight than most men's threats. He stopped before the block, his gaze locking not on Jedediah, but on the startled, portly figure of preacher Eli, who was present more out of a sense of reluctant civic duty than any real spiritual authority in this godless pit. Silas's voice, when it came, was rough from disuse, yet it cut through the din with the sharp edge of honed steel. "Preacher," he said, his eyes never leaving the stunned clergyman. "I'll take her." Jedediah puffed up. "Now hold on, Blackwood. The bidding ain't started. If you want her, you pay my price, and then some for my trouble." Silas ignored him. He reached into his worn leather pouch, pulling out not a handful of coins for Jedediah, but a small, tarnished silver ring, his mother's. He addressed preacher Eli again, his voice resonating with an unshakable finality that silenced every jeer, every whisper. Marries, a collective gasp sucked the air from the room. Jedediah's jaw dropped. Ilara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief, a flicker of something unreadable, fear, confusion, perhaps a dawning, terrified hope, igniting in their haunted depths. Preacher Eli stammered, "Marry?" "Now, Silas, this is highly unorthodox. There are forms, bans." Silas's gaze was unwavering. He laid a heavy sack of coins on the preacher's trembling Bible, enough to cover any debt the Jedediah might claim and then some, a clear message that this was not a purchase of a woman, but a transaction to sever her chains. "She needs protection, preacher. The kind only a husband can give in a town like this." Now the authority in his tone was absolute, the desperate logic of it hanging in the suddenly still air. It was a mad act, a shocking claim, but in that moment, it was also an undeniable shield. The preacher, caught between Silas's unyielding stare and the unspoken threat of Jedediah's brewing fury, fumbled through the briefest, most bewildered ceremony the frontier had ever witnessed. His words were a nervous torrent, the vows nearly swallowed by the thick, stunned silence of the onlookers. Ilara stood frozen, a statue of disbelief, her hand trembling uncontrollably when Silas, with a gentleness that was startling in a man of his rough exterior, reached for it. His grip was firm, calloused, yet surprisingly steady, a small island of solidity in the dizzying whirlpool of her terror and confusion. He didn't look at her face, perhaps sensing her overwhelming shock, but kept his eyes on the preacher, a silent demand for expediency. Jedediah sputtered, veins bulging in his neck, but even his bluster faltered before the quiet, implacable will of Silas Blackwood and the sudden, if reluctant, sanctity of the church's words, however rushed. The coins Silas had placed on the Bible were a clear settlement of any perceived financial claim, removing Jedediah's primary leverage. When the preacher finally, breathlessly, declared them man and wife, a collective sigh seemed to ripple through the room, a mixture of shock, disapproval, and a grudging, bewildered respect for Silas's audacity. Silas nodded once, curtly, to the preacher. Then, without a word to his new, stunned bride, he gently but firmly guided her off the auction block, his hand a protective barrier between her and the gaping crowd. He retrieved his sack of coins, leaving a generous portion for the preacher's troubles and the town's poor box, a gesture that further cemented the legitimacy of his actions in the eyes of the few who cared for such things. He led Ilara towards the exit, the throng parting before them like water before a prow. Jedediah made a move to follow, his face a mask of thwarted rage, but a single, cold glance from Silas stopped him in his tracks. There was a promise in that look, a warning of consequences Jedediah was not fool enough to test, not when Silas was on his own ground, driven by a purpose that was clearly unshakable. Outside, the wind howled a little louder, whipping Ilara's thin dress around her legs and snatching the breath from her lungs. The sudden exposure to the raw elements after the stifling auction house made her sway. Silas's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on her arm, steadying her. His horse, a sturdy sorrel gelding, stood hitched to a rail, patient and calm. He had no wagon, just the horse. For a terrifying moment, Ilara thought he might abandon her right there, the marriage a mere ploy. But he moved towards the animal, then paused, looking down at her for the first time since the ceremony. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were shadowed, unreadable, but they held no malice, none of the leering cruelty she was so accustomed to. He simply gestured to the horse. "We ride," he said, his voice still gravelly, but quieter now, less a command than a statement of fact. He lifted her, with surprising ease despite his limp, onto the saddle, then swung himself up behind her, his presence a solid, unfamiliar wall at her back. The journey to Broken Arrow Ranch began in silence, a silence as vast and unknowable as the darkening plains that stretched before them. Ilara huddled into herself, every muscle tensed, bracing for the inevitable cruelty she had been taught to expect, yet it did not come. There was only the rhythmic sway of the horse, the creak of leather, and the vast, indifferent expanse of the wilderness swallowing them whole, carrying them away from the judgment of Dust Devil Creek. The trail to Broken Arrow Ranch was a lonely scar upon the face of the land, winding through sere hills and shadowed canyons. Ilara rode slumped against Silas, a silent, shivering passenger, the shock of the evening rendering her almost numb. Each league they covered felt like a journey further into an unknown, perhaps more terrifying, world than the one she had just escaped. The ranch, when they finally reached it hours later, well after the moon had climbed its cold celestial path, was little more than a collection of shadows huddled against the vast, star-dusted sky. A small, sturdy cabin, a weathered barn, and a few corrals stood starkly against the wilderness, the silence broken only by the mournful sigh of the wind through the eaves and the distant yip of a coyote. There were no welcoming lights, no sounds of life other than their own arrival. It was a place that spoke of solitude, of hardship, and of an existence pared down to its barest essentials. Silas dismounted, his movements economical despite his limp, and then reached up to help her down. His hands were rough, but his touch was unexpectedly careful, as if he were handling something fragile. Ilara stumbled, her legs stiff and unused to riding for so long, and he steadied her without comment. He led the horse to the barn, and Ilara remained where he left her, a small, lost figure in the immense darkness, clutching the tattered remnants of her shawl around her shoulders, the cold seeping into her bones. She watched him, a silhouette moving with practiced efficiency in the dim light spilling from the barn door as he unsaddled the gelding. Fear, cold and sharp, was a familiar companion, and it whispered insidious warnings in her mind. What new torment awaited her here, in this desolate place, with this silent, enigmatic man who had claimed her with such shocking abruptness? When he returned, he carried a lantern, its flickering glow pushing back the oppressive darkness just enough to illuminate the path to the cabin. He didn't speak, merely gestured for her to follow. The cabin's interior was as spare as its exterior, a single room, dominated by a large stone hearth where embers still glowed faintly. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a narrow cot in one corner, and shelves holding a few necessities were the only furnishings. It was clean, meticulously so, but undeniably Spartan. The air smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something else, a faint, lingering scent of solitude itself. Silas moved to the hearth, adding kindling and a few small logs, coaxing the embers back to life. Flames soon licked upwards, casting dancing shadows and a welcome, if meager, warmth into the chill room. He then ladled water from a bucket into a pot, hanging it over the fire. Still, he said nothing. Ilara stood by the door, uncertain, her eyes darting around the small space, assessing every shadow, every unfamiliar object, for potential threats. She was a wild thing, cornered and terrified, expecting a blow at any moment. He glanced at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering firelight. "There's stew," he said, his voice low. "And a blanket," he indicated the cot. "You can sleep there." He then turned away, busying himself with stirring the pot, his broad back to her. Ilara didn't move. The offer of food, of a place to sleep, was so far removed from her experiences with Jedediah that she couldn't process it. Was it a trick? A prelude to some new cruelty? She waited, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, for the other shoe to drop. But Silas simply continued his quiet ministrations at the hearth, the silence stretching between them, thick and heavy with unspoken fears and uncertainties. The smell of the warming stew, however, began to penetrate her fear, a primal reminder of her body's desperate need. It had been so long since she'd eaten anything more than scraps. Days at Broken Arrow Ranch settled into a rhythm dictated by the sun and the needs of the land, a rhythm of quiet labor and profound silence. Ilara, driven by a deeply ingrained fear of being deemed useless, a fear reinforced by Jedediah's constant accusations of her being too sick to work, rose before dawn each day. She found tasks for herself, small, hesitant attempts to earn her keep in this strange, new sanctuary. She swept the cabin floor with a worn broom, her movements furtive, always expecting a rebuke. She fetched water from the well, the bucket heavy in her thin arms, her breath catching in her chest with the effort, a reminder of the frailty Jedediah had so cruelly exploited. She tried to help with the chickens Silas kept in a small, well-maintained coop, her hands trembling as she scattered feed, unused to the gentle clucking of the hens after years of harsh commands and the snap of a whip. Silas watched her, his gaze steady and unreadable from beneath the brim of his hat. He never praised her, but more importantly, he never criticized. He simply observed, his silence a vast, echoing space that Ilara slowly, tentatively, began to fill with her own cautious existence. He would leave a tin plate of food for her on the table after he ate, warm porridge in the morning, a portion of whatever he'd cooked for his midday meal, usually beans or salted meat. He never forced her to eat with him, never commented if she only picked at the food, her stomach still clenched with anxiety. Small kindnesses began to accumulate, unspoken gestures that were more eloquent than any words. One morning, she found a thicker, mended blanket folded neatly on her cot, replacing the threadbare one she'd been using. Another day, he left a pair of his old, patched but sturdy gloves beside her water bucket, noticing perhaps how the rough wood of the well handle chafed her raw hands. When a cold wind whistled through a chink in the cabin wall near her cot, she awoke the next morning to find he had meticulously sealed it with mud and straw while she slept. He fixed the loose handle on the cabin door, a small thing, but it stopped the jarring rattle that always made her jump. These actions, performed without fanfare, without expectation of gratitude, began to chip away at the wall of fear and distrust Ilara had built around herself. She remained wary, her movements still bird-like and quick to flinch, but a tiny seed of something akin to safety began to take root in the barren soil of her heart. She started to notice the stark beauty of the ranch, the way the sunrise painted the desolate hills in hues of rose and gold, the resilience of the wildflowers that pushed their way through the rocky soil, the quiet strength of the man who moved through this landscape with a familiar grace, his limp a testament to past battles fought and survived. He was a part of this land, as weathered and enduring as the ancient cottonwoods that lined the creek bed. She still didn't understand why he had done what he did in town, why he offered this quiet haven instead of the brutality she had expected. The question hung in the air between them, unspoken, unanswered, yet the daily rhythm of shared solitude, punctuated by his silent acts of care, began to feel less like a trap and more like a fragile, tentative reprieve. She still worked, driven by that old fear, but now, a new, almost imperceptible desire began to stir within her, a desire to make this place, if not a home, then at least a place where she could breathe without terror. One evening, as the chill of the high desert night crept into the small cabin, Silas sat by the fire, sharpening a knife with slow, deliberate strokes of a whetstone. The only sounds were the scrape of steel on stone, the crackle of the flames, and the whisper of the wind outside. Ilara sat on her cot, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching the firelight dance on the rough-hewn walls. The silence, usually a heavy blanket, felt different tonight, thinner, somehow more expectant. He had been quieter than usual that day, his gaze often distant, lost in some unseen landscape of memory. The anniversary of something, she sensed, though she knew not what. Finally, he set the knife and stone aside, his large, calloused hands resting on his knees. He stared into the flames for a long moment, his profile stark and deeply etched in the firelight. When he spoke, his voice was low, rougher than usual, as if dragged from a deep, painful place. "Gettysburg," he said, the single word hanging heavy in the air. Ilara looked at him, her own fear momentarily eclipsed by the raw pain she heard in that one word. He didn't look at her, but continued to stare into the fire, his story unfolding slowly, hesitantly, like a man treading on broken glass. He spoke of the roar of cannons, the screams of men, the choking smoke and the metallic taste of fear and blood. He spoke of his younger brother, barely a man, who had fallen beside him, his bright spirit extinguished in a heartbeat. His name was Caleb, Silas said, his voice cracking almost imperceptibly. He always saw the good in things. Even then. Even there he traced a pattern in the dust on the hearth with a fingertip. I carried him back. Or what was left to carry. The silence that followed was profound, filled with the ghosts of that terrible battlefield. Ilara felt a strange ache in her own chest, an echo of his grief. For the first time, she saw beyond the stoic rancher, the silent protector, to the wounded man beneath. She saw the source of the deep sadness that always seemed to cling to him, the reason for his solitary existence. He had built this isolated ranch not just as a refuge from the world, but as a mausoleum for his own shattered heart. He spoke of the guilt, the crushing weight of being the one who survived, the endless loop of what-ifs that had haunted his nights for years. His limp, he explained, was a souvenir from that same battle, a piece of shrapnel that had shattered his leg, a constant, physical reminder of the day his world had fractured. Sharing this, Ilara realized, was an act of profound trust, a bearing of his deepest wound. He wasn't asking for pity, nor was he seeking absolution. He was simply sharing the burden, perhaps, with the only other soul who inhabited his desolate world. Ilara didn't speak. There were no words adequate for such sorrow. Instead, she did the only thing she could think of. She rose slowly from her cot, her movements hesitant, and picked up the battered tin coffeepot from the edge of the hearth where it always sat. She filled it with fresh water from the bucket and added a precious spoonful of coffee grounds from the small sack Silas kept on a high shelf. She hung the pot over the flames, her movements quiet and purposeful. It was a small gesture, a simple act of domesticity, but in the charged atmosphere of the cabin, it felt like an offering, a silent acknowledgement of his pain, a quiet promise of companionship in the face of shared desolation. As the coffee began to heat, its aroma slowly filling the small space, a fragile bridge seemed to form between them, built not of words, but of shared sorrow and the tentative beginnings of human connection. The firelight softened the harsh lines of his face, and for a fleeting moment, Ilara thought she saw a flicker of something other than pain in his eyes, a distant, almost forgotten ember of peace. The aroma of coffee, rich and fortifying, slowly filled the small cabin, a stark contrast to the raw wound Silas had just exposed. He watched her, his early attention seeming to ease fractionally as she moved with quiet competence around the hearth. When the coffee was ready, she poured a steaming cup into his usual chipped tin mug and, after a moment's hesitation, a smaller amount into the only other cup the cabin possessed, a slightly dented one she had scrubbed clean days ago. She offered him his mug, her hand trembling slightly. He took it, their fingers brushing for a fleeting instant. The contact was brief, accidental, yet it sent a strange jolt through Ilara, a spark of warmth in the cold landscape of her fear. She retreated to her cot, cradling her own cup, the warmth seeping into her tilled hands. The silence returned, but it was different now, less a chasm and more a shared space, made softer by his confession. After a long while, Silas spoke again, his voice still low but steadier. "Why did Jedediah call you sick? You work hard. Harder than you should." The question was direct, yet gentle, devoid of the accusation she had always heard in similar inquiries. Ilara stared into her cup, the steam curling up to mist her face. The trust he had shown her, the vulnerability he had displayed, seemed to create a small opening for her own story. It was a terrifying prospect, to voice the shame and misery Jedediah had ground into her, but Silas's quiet gaze was expectant, not demanding. I was never strong," she began, her voice barely a whisper, rusty from disuse and thick with unshed tears. "My family, they had too many mouths. I was always the one who caught fevers, who coughed through the winters." She didn't say they'd sold her, the shame was too profound. "Jedediah, he said I was pretending. That I was lazy." She took a shaky breath, the memories like shards of glass in her throat. "Every time I faltered, every time I coughed too much or couldn't lift what he wanted, he beat me. He said it was the only way to cure my sickness." Her voice broke on the last word. She didn't cry, not with tears, but a dry, racking sob escaped her, a sound of pure desolation. He said I was broken. Useless, the words tumbled out, a torrent of humiliation and pain held back for so long. She spoke of the gnawing hunger, the constant cold, the casual cruelty that had been her daily bread. She spoke of the darkness, not just the physical darkness of the root cellar where he sometimes locked her, but the darkness in her soul, the slow extinguishing of hope. She confessed her deepest fear, that Jedediah was right, that she truly was nothing more than a broken, sickly burden, undeserving of kindness, unworthy of life itself. As she spoke, Silas listened, his expression unchanging, yet his eyes, those stormy grey eyes, seemed to absorb her pain, reflecting a deep, empathetic understanding. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer platitudes. He simply bore witness to her story, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her remembered trauma. When she finally fell silent, exhausted and trembling, the only sounds were her ragged breaths and the crackling fire. He didn't move for a long time. Then, slowly, he reached out, not to touch her, but to gently poke the fire, sending a fresh shower of sparks up the chimney. "You ain't broken, Ilara," he said, his voice quiet but firm, resonating with a conviction that startled her. "You're a survivor. And there ain't no sickness in you that a little peace and good food won't mend." His words, simple and direct, were like a balm to her raw wounds. For the first time, someone had looked past the labels, past the scars, and seen not her perceived flaws, but her endurance. It wasn't absolution, but it was acceptance, and in the quiet desolation of Broken Arrow Ranch, it felt like a lifeline. The fragile peace of their shared confessions was shattered by the fury of the winter's first blizzard. It descended upon Broken Arrow Ranch with little warning, a howling white maelstrom that blotted out the sun and transformed the familiar landscape into a treacherous, alien world. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the cabin's shutters and driving snow into every tiny crevice. For 2 days, they were marooned, the world reduced to the 4 walls of the small cabin and the roaring tempest outside. Silas worked tirelessly to secure the livestock, his face grim as he battled the elements, returning to the cabin crusted with snow, his breath pluming in the frigid air. On the 3rd day, the storm still raged, and Silas, who had pushed himself to his limits, collapsed. He awoke from a restless sleep with a raging fever, his skin burning to the touch, his breath shallow and rasping. The old war wound in his leg, always sensitive to extreme cold and exertion, throbbed with an angry, inflamed pulse. He was delirious, muttering about Caleb, about battles long past, his strong frame racked with violent shivers despite the blankets Ilara piled upon him. Fear, sharper and more immediate than any she had felt for herself, gripped Ilara. This man, her silent protector, her unlikely savior, was now utterly vulnerable, his life hanging by a thread in the face of the storm's unrelenting assault and the treachery of his own body. Jedediah's taunts of her being too sick to work, too useless, echoed in her mind, but there was no time for self-doubt. The instincts for survival, honed by years of hardship, and a deeper, newly awakened instinct to protect the man who had shown her the first glimmers of kindness, surged through her. This was not the frailty Jedediah had despised, this was a quiet, desperate strength she hadn't known she possessed. She remembered the herbs her grandmother, a woman whispered to have healing hands, used to gather in the woods of her distant childhood. Scraps of forgotten knowledge surfaced in her mind, willow bark for fever, horehound for coughs, comfrey for wounds. With the storm still howling, venturing out was a perilous risk, but Silas's life depended on it. Bundling herself in his spare coat, which swallowed her small frame, and wrapping a thick wool scarf around her head and face, she braved the blizzard. The wind tore at her, the snow blinded her, but she pushed on, her small figure a mere speck against the vast, white fury. She fought her way to the sheltered creek bed where she had seen willows growing, their branches now laden with snow. Her hands, numb with cold, fumbled as she stripped bark from the younger branches. She found a small, hardy patch of horehound near the barn, its leaves dusted with white. Back in the cabin, her fingers clumsy with cold, she brewed a potent tea from the willow bark, coaxing Silas to drink the bitter liquid between his fevered ramblings. She crushed the horehound leaves, mixing them with a little precious honey she found in his stores, and managed to get him to swallow small amounts. She bathed his burning forehead with snowmelt, her touch surprisingly gentle, her voice a low, soothing murmur as she spoke to him, not of anything in particular, just soft sounds to calm his delirium. For days, as the blizzard raged and then slowly subsided, Ilara was his constant attendant. She kept the fire blazing, melted snow for water, forced broth and herbal remedies past his lips, and cleaned and rebandaged his inflamed leg with strips of her own worn petticoat, using a poultice of crushed comfrey leaves she'd miraculously found beneath a sheltering rock overhang. She barely slept, her exhaustion a dull ache at the back of her mind, overshadowed by the fierce, protective urgency that drove her. Slowly, miraculously, the fever began to recede. Silas's ramblings quieted, his breathing eased. One morning, as pale winter sunlight finally broke through the clouds, casting a weak glow into the cabin, he opened his eyes, his gaze clear, lucid. He looked at Ilara, truly seeing her for the first time in days, her face pale with fatigue, dark circles under her eyes, but her expression resolute. He was weak, but the fire of infection had passed. "Ilara," he rasped, his voice weak. He tried to sit up, but she gently pushed him back. "Rest," she whispered, her voice surprisingly firm. "The sickness has passed. But you need to regain your strength." He looked around the cabin, at the organized neatness, the lingering scent of herbs, and then back at her, a dawning understanding in his tired eyes. This sickly girl, this broken creature, had saved his life. As Silas slowly regained his strength under Ilara's diligent care, a new, deeper quiet settled between them, no longer born of fear or uncertainty, but of shared experience and a profound, unspoken gratitude. He watched her move about the cabin, her slight form possessed of an unexpected resilience, her hands, once so hesitant, now deft and capable as she tended the fire, prepared their sparse meals, or ground herbs with a focused intensity. He saw not the sick girl Jedediah had abused, but a woman of quiet fortitude and hidden wisdom. The community of Dust Devil Creek, however, had not forgotten Ilara, nor Silas's audacious act of claiming her. Whispers, like tumbleweeds, had blown from the auction house, carried on the winds of gossip and speculation. Jedediah Sykes, his pride wounded and his greed stoked by the thought of Ilara being useful after all, had been nursing his resentment. He'd heard tell of the blizzard that had isolated Broken Arrow Ranch, and a cruel, opportunistic idea had taken root in his twisted mind. He imagined Blackwood weakened, perhaps even dead, and the girl ripe for the taking, someone he could punish for her defiance and Silas's interference. He gathered two like-minded cronies, men as coarse and morally bankrupt as himself, their courage bolstered by whiskey and the promise of a share in whatever spoils they might find. One crisp morning, when the snow had hardened enough to bear their weight, they rode towards Broken Arrow, their approach masked by the uneven terrain and the lingering hush of the post-blizzard landscape. Ilara was outside, scattering feed for the chickens, the winter sun glinting on the fresh snow, when she heard the distinct sound of approaching horses, too many horses for Silas, who was still mostly confined to the cabin. A prickle of unease, an old, familiar dread, tightened her chest. Her senses, sharpened by years of living on the precipice of danger, screamed a warning. She glanced towards the cabin, where Silas was propped up near the fire, still weak but determinedly mending a piece of tack. She didn't want to alarm him unnecessarily, but the feeling of menace was too strong to ignore. She moved to the edge of the small yard, peering towards the low rise from which the sounds came. Then she saw them, 3 riders, dark figures against the white snow, Jedediah Sykes unmistakably in the lead, his brutish form slouched in the saddle. Terror, cold and sharp, pierced through her. He had come back. He had come back for her. Her first instinct was to flee, to hide, but where could she go? And what of Silas? He was in no condition to defend himself, let alone her. A different instinct, born of the firestorm she had just weathered in saving him, surged through her. This was her haven, however fragile, and Silas was the man who had given it to her. She would not let Jedediah destroy it, or him. She turned and ran, not away, but towards the cabin, her heart pounding like a trapped bird against her ribs. "Silas," she cried, bursting through the door, her voice breathless with panic. "Silas, it's Jedediah. He's here. With other men." Silas's head snapped up, his eyes instantly alert, the weakness momentarily forgotten. He pushed himself up, his face grim, reaching for the old rifle that always leaned near the hearth. His movements were slow, hampered by his recent illness, but his resolve was like iron. He looked at Ilara, at the terror in her eyes, and a cold fury, an emotion he had long suppressed, began to smolder within him. He had fought in a war to protect ideals, now he would fight to protect this woman, this fragile piece they had begun to build in the heart of desolation. The past he had tried to bury, his reluctance to embrace violence, crumbled in the face of this immediate, brutal threat. Jedediah Sykes and his men rode into the ranch yard with arrogant confidence, their expressions a mixture of greed and malice. "Blackwood!" Jedediah bellowed, his voice echoing in the crisp air. "Heard you was under the weather. Come to see if the missus needs a stronger hand to guide her." His laughter was a harsh, ugly sound. The cabin door creaked open, and Silas stood framed in the doorway, his tall figure looking gaunt but resolute, the rifle held loosely but purposefully in his hands. Ilara stood just behind him, her small hand gripping his arm, a silent show of solidarity. "She's not for your guidance, Sykes," Silas said, his voice quiet but carrying an unmistakable edge of cold steel. "This is my land. My wife." "Ride out," Jedediah sneered, his eyes flicking dismissively over Silas's weakened state, then lingering on Ilara with a predatory gleam. "Your wife?" After a 5-minute preacher's mumble. "Don't make me laugh, Blackwood. She's mine. Always was. Just misplaced property." He gestured to his companions. "We're here to collect." One of the cronies, a lanky man with shifty eyes, started to dismount, a pistol in his hand. "Best not make this harder than it needs to be." Old man Silas didn't flinch. The years of suppressing his wartime instincts, his deep-seated aversion to violence born from too much bloodshed, felt like a distant memory. All that remained was a burning clarity of purpose. He had to protect Ilara, protect the nascent life they had begun to forge. His gaze hardened. "Last warning, Sykes." "Leave." Jedediah laughed again, a coarse, barking sound. "Or what, Blackwood? You gonna shoot us all with that rusty pea shooter? You look like a puff of wind could blow you over." He spurred his horse a step closer. It happened fast. As Jedediah raised a hand, perhaps to gesture his men forward, perhaps to draw his own weapon, Silas moved. He wasn't as quick as he once was, his body still bearing the ravages of fever, but his aim was true. He didn't fire at Jedediah, not yet. Instead, he sent a shot into the hard-packed snow just inches from Jedediah's horse's hooves. The animal screamed and reared violently, throwing Jedediah unceremoniously into a snowdrift. Simultaneously, Ilara, acting on pure instinct, grabbed a heavy iron skillet from the hearth, the one she used to cook their meals, and, with a surprising surge of strength, hurled it with all her might. It spun through the air and connected with the dismounting crony's gun hand with a sickening thud. The man howled in pain, his pistol clattering uselessly to the ground. The third man, seeing his employer floundering in the snow and his companion disarmed and clutching a surely broken hand, lost his nerve. He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, not even looking back. Jedediah scrambled out of the snowdrift, his face purple with rage and humiliation, sputtering snow and curses. He lunged for his own pistol, but Silas had already chambered another round, the rifle now aimed squarely at Jedediah's chest. "It's over, Sykes," Silas said, his voice deadly calm. "Get on your horse. Take your friend. And if you ever show your face near this ranch, or her, again, I won't aim for the snow." There was no doubt in his tone, no hesitation in his eyes. Jedediah, faced with Silas's unwavering resolve and the undeniable evidence of Ilara's fierce protectiveness, finally seemed to understand. The fight was gone from him, replaced by a sullen, bitter defeat. He helped his groaning companion back onto his horse, then mounted his own, casting one last hateful glare at Silas and Ilara. Then they rode away, leaving only the churned snow and the ringing silence of their departure. Silas lowered the rifle, a tremor running through him, the adrenaline ebbing away, leaving him bone-weary but upright. Ilara rushed to his side, her face pale but her eyes shining with a fierce light. "Are you all right?" she whispered, her hand instinctively going to his arm again, this time to steady him. He leaned against the doorframe, looking down at her. He saw not fear, but an astonishing courage. He saw the woman who had nursed him back from the brink, who had faced down his tormentor. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved wooden bird, a sparrow, something he'd whittled during the long, quiet evenings before the blizzard. He pressed it into her hand. "I didn't buy you, Ilara," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I don't keep you. I choose you. Every day, I choose you." Her fingers closed around the smooth wood, her eyes filling with tears, the first true tears he had ever seen her shed, not of sorrow, but of overwhelming relief and a dawning, incredulous joy. He then fumbled in another pocket, producing the tarnished silver ring, his mother's ring, the one he'd used in that rushed ceremony. He took her trembling hand, the one not holding the sparrow, and gently slid the ring onto her finger. "This," he said softly, "is for always, if you'll have it." Ilara could only nod, a sob catching in her throat, the small, warm weight of the sparrow in one hand, the cool circle of the ring on the other, twin symbols of a future she had never dared to imagine. A year drifted by, seasons turning the high desert landscape from the harsh white of winter to the vibrant greens and golds of spring and summer, then to the russet hues of autumn. The name A Broken Arrow Ranch slowly faded from local parlance, replaced by a new name, whispered at first, then spoken with a quiet respect, Sparrow's Rest. Ilara blossomed in the sanctuary she and Silas had defended. The sickness that had plagued her under Jedediah's cruelty vanished, replaced by a quiet vitality. Her cheeks gained color, her frame filled out, and her eyes, once haunted, now held a clear, steady light. She moved with a newfound confidence, her steps sure on the land she had come to love. Her intuitive knowledge of herbs, revealed during Silas's illness, became a quiet legend. She cultivated a small, thriving garden near the cabin, filled with healing plants and fragrant flowers, their bright colors a testament to the life she was nurturing. The townsfolk of Dust Devil Creek, initially suspicious and scornful, began to change their tune. Stories of Ilara's courage during the confrontation with Jedediah, coupled with whispers of her uncanny ability to soothe colicky babies or mend stubborn fevers with her herbal remedies, started to circulate. One by one, hesitantly at first, they began to make the trek to Sparrow's Rest, not with judgment, but with requests for help. A mother with a sick child, a farmer with an injured animal, an old prospector with an aching joint, Ilara received them all with quiet grace, offering her knowledge and her gentle touch. She never asked for payment, but gifts began to appear on their doorstep, a sack of flour, a freshly baked pie, a length of warm wool fabric. Silas watched her transformation with a quiet pride that warmed him deeper than any hearth fire. The harsh lines around his own eyes softened, his limp seemed less pronounced, and the ghosts of Gettysburg, while never entirely banished, no longer held sole dominion over his heart. He found himself smiling more, small, infrequent smiles that Ilara treasured. He taught her to ride properly, to mend fences, to read the signs of the weather in the clouds. She, in turn, filled their small cabin with the scent of baking bread, the quiet hum of her tending her plants, and a sense of peace he had thought lost to him forever. They rarely spoke of the past, of Jedediah or the auction house. Their life was rooted in the present, in the daily rhythms of the ranch, in the shared glances and comfortable silences that spoke volumes more than words. The hand-carved sparrow Silas had given her sat on the mantelpiece, a constant reminder of her chosenness, of her strength. His mother's ring never left her finger. One cool evening, as they sat on the small porch they had added to the cabin, watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery colors, Ilara leaned her head against Silas's shoulder. He instinctively put his arm around her, a gesture of easy affection that had become as natural as breathing. The wind whispered through the tall prairie grass, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain, but it no longer sounded mournful. It sounded like a promise. They had faced despair, both public and private, and found not just survival, but a profound and healing love, a quiet haven built by two resilient souls who had chosen each other against the harshness of the world. Sparrow's Rest was more than a ranch, it was a testament to the enduring power of kindness, courage, and the extraordinary strength found in the most unexpected of hearts. They had healed each other, and in doing so, had created a true home, a sanctuary not just for themselves, but for the hope they now embodied. And so the lonely rancher and the resilient outcast, once symbols of the frontier's harsh judgment, became its quiet inspiration, their love story a gentle melody in the rugged symphony of the West. If this story of courage, redemption, and the healing power of unconditional love touched your heart, please show your support. Like this video, share it with others who might find inspiration in Ilara and Silas's journey, and subscribe to our channel for more tales that remind us of the strength of the human spirit. Your engagement helps us bring these stories of hope to the world. Thank you for watching.